Star Trek, Starfleet Academy, Crisis on Vulcan, Chapter 3. Gandar was huge and terrible in the view screen, its gaseous surface whipped by hydrogen winds rushing at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Along the night terminator, branches of lightning forked and sputtered, some so long that on Vulcan they would have reached from one hemisphere of the planet halfway around the other. At the poles, coronas of electromagnetic energy pulsed and glowed 100 colors, all shades of red, blue, violet, green, and yellow. Watching the chaotic surface, which moved visibly, the enormous planet spun on its poles every 8.3 hours, giving it days and nights just over 4 hours long each. Spock wondered what it would be like to live on either of the two habitable moons. The moons were both in tidal lock, with one face forever toward this gas giant, the other eternally facing space. Anyone on the inner hemisphere would always see that vast orange sphere hanging overhead, day or night, taking up half the sky, seeming almost close enough to touch. It must be oppressive, Spock thought. It'd be like waiting for the sky to fall. The innermost moon, Fleta, whirled around the giant planet in a complete orbit every 8 days. Unlike its primary, Fleta had a night 4 days long, and then another variable one when it plunged into Gandar's deep shadow. Fortunately, the gas giant, too small to be a real star, still had enough reaction heat to warm the little moon. The other inhabited moon, Jarita, was farther out in a 3-week orbit. It was also colder, and the marathons who disembarked there beamed down, wearing envirosuits that provided precious warmth. Jarita's space-facing hemisphere was too cold for habitation, so all the colonists lived on the planet side. And once they had gone, only the half-dozen representatives of Shakir remained in the marathon quarters. Spock saw little of them. Cha had retreated from friendship and was distant and cool whenever Spock saw him. The adults, including the aged and grim Hol-Manak Lasvor, gave Spock even less notice. Once Spock and Sarek, on their way to an observation deck, met Minnick coming the other way. The old marathon glowered at them, his eyes flashing. Sarek inclined his head politely. "Live long and prosper, Ambassador Minnick," he murmured. "We know what you have done," Minnick said, and he swept past them. Spock looked after him. "What did he mean, Father?" Sarek took some moments before replying. "The Shakir colonists are the most bitter," he said at last. "A religious war forced them off the planet more than 200 years ago. Shakir is a hard environment, bitterly cold except in one narrow habitable band. Hol-Manak Lasvor leads a faction that wishes to retake Marith itself, to impose order and enforce obedience to the Shakirian branch of their faith on the homeworld." "Impossible," Spock said at once. "Their numbers are far too small." "Dreams of glory die hard, my son, and when those dreams turn bitter, they lead to thoughts of tyranny and revenge." They spoke no more of it, but a few days later, when the Enterprise went into orbit around the inhospitable planet Shakir, Spock remembered his father's words. Shakir was a gloomy reddish-purple sphere, its rocky surface splotched with frozen hydrocarbons and water ice. Cratered and ancient, even its sunward face looked dark, forbidding. The planet had one redeeming feature. Unlike Vulcan or Earth, which inclined on their poles relative to their suns, Shakir's north and south poles were almost exactly vertical with regard to the binary sun. The planet had no seasons at all. But because the warmth was constant, it did have a narrow green band around its equator, only several hundred kilometers broad. Here liquid water existed, barely. Night temperatures invariably were below freezing, and tough, hardy plant life grew in abundance. Here, too, the marathon colonists had dug in, fashioning underground homes, complexes of tunnels, and here they led mole-like existences buried underground, but dreaming of the stars. "Farewell, Cha," Spock said as he stood beside Lieutenant Commander Pike. On the transporter pad, Cha glanced at his father and then barely nodded. His face was blank, expressionless. "Energize," said Hol-Manak Lasvor, his voice cold. "Energizing," responded Pike. He adjusted the controls, the transporter gave its peculiar musical hum, and the last 6 marathons beamed off the ship. "Well," said Pike, "that's done. You busy, Spock?" "No, I have nothing to do at the moment." "Then come with me and we'll drop into the junior officer's wardroom. We senior officers like to eat with them from time to time. A glimpse of our splendor encourages them to do their best and become worthy of promotion." "Really?" Pike laughed at Spock's quizzical expression. "No, a joke. But it is an old service tradition, and the junior officers invited me today. They'll be glad to have you join them as well." "A joke," Spock said thoughtfully. "I know the concept of humor, but what is its purpose?" With a shrug, Pike said, "To relieve stress, I suppose." "Did beaming the marathons down cause you stress?" Pike led the way into the corridor. "Beaming them down didn't, but perhaps having them on board did. We tried to be as hospitable as possible. Whole men at Glassware even got an in-depth inspection of the computer and engineering sections, but they weren't cheerful guests." "No," agreed Spock. The wardroom was a narrow, curving compartment with 4 tables, each one with 4 to 6 young men and women already seated. They welcomed the newcomers, and Pike himself brought Spock's vegetarian lunch to the table. Spock was quiet as he ate, listening to the exchanges between the young Starfleet officers with interest. Much was technical, a discussion of some minor computer problems that had just appeared, from what Spock gathered, and much was humorous. The cadets, ensigns, and lieutenants all seemed to be enjoying their lives immensely. At the end of the meal, the bald helmsman, Lieutenant Ban, called out to Spock from the next table, "Stick around. You can see me teach this young upstart from engineering a lesson in 3-dimensional chess." Spock turned to Pike. "May I?" "By all means," said Pike, gesturing Spock toward the table. "Are you a chess aficionado, Mr. Spock?" "I am not. I do not know what chess is, but I am interested." "Ah, well, come on," said Ban, grinning. He and the others had cleared the table and had set up something resembling an abstract sculpture, a kind of branching structure with flat rectangles here and there, the rectangles divided into brown and ivory squares. As he set silver and ebony figures on this device, Ban said, "Mr. Spock, I don't think you've met Ensign Thedra Alfort. Thedra? Spock is the son of Sarek, the Vulcan ambassador who arranged the Marathon Treaty." Thedra Alfort was a young human female with short black hair, startling blue eyes, and a quizzical expression. She nodded to Spock. "How do you do?" Spock knew enough about human speech not to ask, "How do I do what?" He merely nodded gravely in response. "You are an engineer?" he asked. "One day I may be," Thedra said with a wry grin. "Right now I'm desperately trying to learn." Ban held out his clenched hands. "Choose." Thedra tapped his right hand, and he opened it to reveal a silver figurine. "You go first." He put the silver chessman and an ebony one matching it on the board. To Spock he said, "I'm the chess champion of the Enterprise. Thedra has rashly decided to challenge me." "Ah," said Spock, "it is a contest." "A contest of wit and intelligence," agreed Ban. "As we play, I'll explain how each piece moves. Maybe you'd like to learn the game." Spock watched as Thedra went down to long, hard-fought defeat. For most of an hour she held her own, or was down only a pawn or so, but Ban had an uncanny knack of anticipating her moves, blocking her plans, and retaliating in unexpected ways. Finally, her king trapped, and one rook just taken by a bishop, Thedra shook her head. "No use," she sighed. "It'd be mate in 4 moves. I resign." "Mate in 3 moves," responded Ban with a grin. "But hey, who's counting?" The young officers had formed a circle around the two, and throughout play they had murmured observations and comments. Now they commiserated with Thedra. "Hey, don't take it so hard," one said. "He beat me in 15 minutes flat." Another punched the speaker playfully on the arm. "And that was no great feat either." "May I play?" Spock asked. They all fell silent, giving him surprised glances. Ban looked up, his bald head glistening. "Are you serious?" Spock raised an eyebrow. "Yes." With a shark-like grin, Ban began to set up the board. "This I have to see," he announced. "Have a seat, my Vulcan friend." "Half Vulcan," Spock responded, sitting across the board from Ban. Ban paused in setting up the pawns. Really? My mother is human, explained Spock. Ban's grin became more friendly. My father is too, he said. My mother's Dalton, though. Well, as one half human to another, good luck. Chance does not appear to play a great role in this contest, Spock observed. With a laugh, Ban said, You take the silver pieces as a courtesy to a new player. Let the slaughter begin. The officers crowded around as Spock made his first move. Lieutenant Ban nodded. A standard gambit, he said, which I counter like this. He moved a pawn. With Spock's next move, a murmur began. Then when he moved again, it became a buzz. Ban frowned at the board, reached to move a knight, thought better of it, and instead castled his king. Spock responded by taking a bishop. I didn't see that coming, someone said. Shh, hissed Ban, scowling in concentration. 3 more exchanges of moves, and then Spock sent his rook down to his opponent's level. I will capture your king with the next move, he said. Ban exhaled. You say checkmate now. Why do I say that? Because you beat me, that's why. Oh, checkmate. 11 minutes and 19 seconds, someone said, honor voice. I never thought it was possible. You've played before, Ban said to Spock. No, I haven't. Come on, how could you beat me if you've never played the game? Spock looked up. He was the center of attention. It is a very logical process, he said simply. They all laughed as if he had made a joke. Even Ban grinned. Spock, I met you 2 years too late. If I'd only known you during my senior year at Starfleet Academy, you could have tutored me in logic. And maybe I could have done better in Fetterling's class and graduated first instead of ninth. Fetterling's a terror, Thedra Alford agreed. Wouldn't it be great to see him arguing with someone as logical as Spock? A muscular lieutenant in a red security tunic chuckled. I'd give up 2 years seniority to see that, he said. Hey, someone else said. Fetterling's class was no joke, but what about the simulator trials? Can't you just see Spock at the control when old Jeffries causes 3 simultaneous systems failures? Zip, zap, zowie. The repairs were all very logical, Mr. Jeffries. Spock said mildly, I do not understand what... A razzing klaxon horn cut him off. The young officers leaped toward the door, and Spock found himself trotting along the corridor beside Mr. Ban. What is happening? He asked. Without looking around, the young lieutenant snapped, We must be under attack. It's a red alert. Starfleet Academy, Crisis on Vulcan, Chapter 4. Spock stepped off the turbolift and stood to one side as Lieutenant Ban relieved an ensign at the helm. Captain April sat in the command seat, his back to Spock, his attention riveted to the view screen. And on the screen, a stocky, grim-faced Marathan, Karos Marsantor, Spock noted, Chaw's father, was speaking. Are completely surrounded, Captain April, and helpless. We are not pirates. We did not seek to rob you, only to prevent great harm to our own people. We want only the certified original of the Marathan Treaty created by the spy Sarek. If you surrender that, you'll be free to go. April's voice was harsh and icy. This is an outrage. Mar, Sarek is no spy. He's a decorated ambassador, and you yourself agreed to the treaty. The Marathan suddenly looked old and weary, but his tone did not change. That does not matter now. I tell you, Hull, Minak, Laswar's rebel fighters will take the treaty by force if they must. The rest of us have no control over them. It was only through the utmost persuasion that we convinced him to allow us to give you this warning. Surrender the spy Sarek and the draft of the treaty, Captain April, and avoid an unnecessary confrontation. April shook his head. This is a grave violation of interstellar law. If Marith truly wants to join the Federation, this is a strange way of going about it. Mar said, Perhaps all of Marith does not want to join the Federation, and if the original draft of the treaty is not transported to Federation headquarters, it never will. Captain April's voice became a bit more conciliatory. Look, Mar, I don't know why you've made this senseless demand. The treaty is not final yet anyway. Whatever your objections are, you have time yet to address them, to correct any errors. You have weeks of negotiations by subspace communication to put the finishing details. The Marathan looked sick, anguished. His voice sounded choked as he muttered, I cannot explain our actions. It is forbidden to speak of such things to outsiders, but please believe me, Captain April, we are well aware of the state of the treaty and of the negotiations still to be done. None of that matters now. April was silent for a long moment. Very well. Let me warn you, though, the Enterprise is well equipped to defend herself against any attack by Marathon fighters. Let your rebel leader know that aggression against a Federation vessel is a serious mistake. This is pointless, said Mar. Captain April, you will transport the official copy of the treaty to the coordinates I will transmit. Ambassador Sarek must be turned over to the Marathon government and exile in Shakir for trial. You have one qual. At the end of that time, if you have not surrendered the draft of the treaty and the ambassador, Minnick will take both by force. The screen blanked, and a second later it resolved into a star field. A qual, said Lieutenant Commander Pike. It's just over 17 standard minutes. Not much time. April stared at the view screen. It showed white streaks against the star-spattered blackness of space, inconsiderable silvery scratches on a vast dark background. There they are. Can you imagine them trying to stand up against our firepower? Sensor report. How many enemy craft? 31, the science officer, Lieutenant Cheney, said promptly. They're all single-pilot attack vessels capable of light speed. I have one isolated. Shall I put it on screen? Yes, Captain April said. Maximum magnification. The view screen wavered and refocused on a streaking silver form. It was delta-shaped, a silver triangle pivoting against the darkness of space and moving fast relative to the stationary background of stars. There was no way of telling how large or small it was with nothing to compare it to. The science officer seemed to sense that, and consulting his instruments said, It is approximately 3.47 meters long with a span of 5.2 meters at its broadest part. The power plant is a Marathon impulse engine with a secondary warp nacelle using matter-antimatter flux. It is armed with one laser cannon and 3 neutron torpedoes. Hopeless, April said, shaking his head. Ants attacking a giant. Raise shields, Mr. Bellis. Aye, Captain. This came from the security station. But a second later, the burly lieutenant manning the console said, Sir, the shields aren't responding. April turned in his seat. Chief Engineer Powell, get on that. Mr. Bellis, arm laser cannon and photon torpedoes. Weapon systems are not responding either, the lieutenant reported. Sir, our defensive and offensive systems are dead in the water. Take us to Warp 4. I can't, Chief Engineer Powell said tightly, working frantically at his station. His seamed face wore an expression of anger and frustration. We've got serious problems here, too. Sir, said the young science officer, without shields, the neutron torpedoes can destroy all life aboard the ship while leaving the physical structures intact. I'm well aware of that, Mr. Cheney, growled April. Number 1, how's our time? We have 14.5 minutes left, sir. April swiveled back. What's wrong with the computers, Mr. Cheney? The science officer was frantically scanning readouts. Sabotage, sir. Someone evidently used a master override device, an isolinear command unit, to alter our security codes. Nothing in the defense or weapons programs is making sense. Solve the problem. Aye, sir, but the mathematics is all wrong. It seems to be base 4, but... Chief Engineer, what about warp speed? Powell turned from his console, and when he spoke, his voice was furious but controlled. Sir, the field damping system is not online. We could conceivably go to warp, but it wouldn't be pleasant, especially with those 30 shielded fighters so close around us. What would happen? The chief engineer rapidly made some calculations. The warp field would be thrown in flux. There's a better than even chance that the warp cores would break down under the strain, and we'd certainly drag a third or more of those ships with us. Their pilots would be dead for sure. Most likely, their antimatter containment fields would collapse, and the Enterprise herself could blow up within 30 seconds of engaging warp drive. What's the risk of a core breakdown? Asked the captain. Chief Engineer Powell shook his head. I'd say roughly 70%. 71.387%, Spock corrected. That is a closer approximation. April turned and glared at him. What's this civilian doing on my bridge? I will leave if you wish, Spock said. However, I believe I may be of use. I have some experience with computer languages, and I may be able to repair your problem. Sir, Pike said, 9 minutes left. Mr. Spock is an extremely gifted young man. It couldn't hurt to let him have a try. Very well, Mr. Spock, take the science officer's console, April said. Spock joined Science Officer Cheney. The key, he said, is at base 4 mathematical structure you mentioned. It is typical of Marathon computer language, unlike your own binary code. May I? Richard Cheney, his lean face drawn even tighter by tension, nodded and made room for Spock. The young Vulcan's thin fingers flew over the console, calling up a dizzying array of symbols and numbers. Sir, said the communications officer, the fighters are in close containment configuration around the ship. We're completely surrounded. I'm putting the enemy vessels on screen. Spock barely glanced around. His one look told him what he already sensed. The 31 Marathon fighters were in tight, angry orbits around the Enterprise, a whirling cloud of gnats around the great starship. Alone, each would be negligible. Even a fully armed fighter could do only minimal damage to the Federation ship, perhaps breaching the hull in one or two places, perhaps killing a few dozen of its crew. But concentrated directed fire from 31 laser cannons could easily disable the Enterprise's unshielded engines. And more than 90 neutron torpedoes, evenly scattered, would instantly kill every life form aboard the ship, leaving everything else intact. Spock concentrated on the computer display. He cut 2 lines of mathematical symbols, erased them, and replaced them with a quick formula of his own devising. Ah, he said, try to raise the shields now. Shields coming up, reported the weapons officer, relief in his voice. Power is rising slowly, 10%, 15, 23, 30, 33% and holding. Shield power is steady, confirmed Chief Engineer Powell. It's still only one feed, though, so we can't bring shields to full. I could try diverting more power to the shields from life support, but that's going to require routing around the sabotage systems. I can't get shields to 50% for another 10 minutes unless we have a miracle. 30% is barely enough to protect us from the laser fire, said April, but the torpedoes would get through. Spock, see if you can give us weapons control. I am working on it. 6 minutes, said Pike. Sir, the enemy ships have detected our shields. They're moving into a tighter pattern. Hold her steady as she goes, April commanded. Aye, sir, said Lieutenant Band, steady as she goes. How are you doing? Asked Cheney anxiously. It is difficult, Spock responded. The computer language in 9 different subroutines has been reset to the base 4 system, but in addition, the programs have been encoded. I suspect there is an encryption key, a code word that I do not know. Perhaps if I routed the patterns through the universal translator array, I could grasp the key word required to free the system. Spock adjusted the controls, and a rolling yellow column of Marathon words, rendered in the elegant curves of Vulcan script, began to scroll upward on one screen so fast that to human eyes they were hardly more than a blur. The science officer reached to touch a control, but Spock grasped his wrist, preventing the change. It is not necessary to slow the display, he explained. I can read very rapidly. 5 minutes, said Pike. Spock tried several Marathon phrases and expressions, but none of them unlocked the sealed programs. The column of words continued to flash by on the screen. 3 minutes, warned Pike. Send a security team to Ambassador Sarek's quarters, ordered Captain April. They may attempt to cut through our shields and board us. He pounded the armrest of his command seat. If I only knew who sabotaged the computer. Minnick, Spock said absently. You gave him access to the engineering and computing sections of the ship. But how could he have overridden our computer security systems? Cheney asked. It is difficult, but possible to do so, responded Spock, his fingers rapidly trying another combination. An isolinear control device would have imitated the computer's normal signal, that it was functioning correctly. The dangerous moments would have been connecting and disconnecting the isolinear device. The rest would have been relatively easy. We are fortunate the Minnick lacked the time to adapt his altered program into binary language. Fortunate! April's exclamation dripped with sarcasm. Yes, because their base 4 configuration has made them simple to isolate. Now, if only 1 minute left, Pike said. Sir, the communications officer said urgently, Commander Minnick is hailing us. Captain April, said Spock almost at the same instant. I have the code. It is Volosh, the name of their jester deity. Shall I put him on screen, sir? Asked the communications officer. April held up his hand. Just a moment. Spock? I have made the necessary changes, Spock said. I am restarting all systems. Now! Shield's going to full power, Lieutenant Bellis exclaimed. Sir, reported Chief Engineer Powell, I have damping control. Warp speed available on your command. Weapon systems online, Bellis said. Powell, can you reverse the polarity of the tractor beam and channel it dead ahead? Clear out a tunnel among the flies so we can shoot through? Aye, sir. Do it. Powell instantly responded. The lights dimmed momentarily. The view screen showed the enemy fighters suddenly thrust out of the way ahead of the ship, pushed aside by an invisible, expanding globe of energy. Give them one warning shot, all laser cannons dead ahead, ordered April. Then I want Warp 4. Scarlet beams of energy flashed through the empty space ahead of the Enterprise. Then the starfield itself blurred as the great ship leaped from impulse power to faster than light speed. After a second of silence, someone cheered, and then the bridge broke into an excited gabble of congratulations. Already the rebels were light seconds behind, with no hope of catching up. April grinned at Spock. Thank you, young man. You saved our bacon. Spock lifted an eyebrow. Animal protein was not involved, he pointed out logically. Throwing his head back, the captain laughed. Well, you helped us escape from a bad position then. Son, if you want my recommendation to Starfleet Academy, you've got it. Spock did not reply. The turbolift doors had opened, and Sarek, clad in his long, silvery gray Vulcan robe, had stepped out. The look he gave his son was grave, tinged with a hint of warning. Enthusiasm, as Sarek had said, was an emotion, an unseemly one. Spock wondered if any trace of enthusiasm had shown on his face at the captain's warm words.